A few weeks ago, Intel announced that they'd lost $16.6 billion in a single quarter. This was by far the biggest loss in the company's history, and for context, it's about 22 times as big a loss as AMD made in profits in the same quarter. Now, some of this came from one-time costs, but that same week, Intel was also kicked out of the Dow Jones Index, where it was replaced by Nvidia. That's a position Intel lost after holding it for 25 years. Intel is having an unimaginably bad time, at the same time as the rest of the chip industry is going through perhaps its biggest boom ever. And yet, if you zoom into their stock price chart, you'll see something really odd. On the day that their catastrophic earnings were announced, their stock price actually jumped about 15%, showing that, perhaps unintuitively, there's actually a bet to be made. This chart shows a concept called the Valley of Death, which is usually used to describe a struggle that startups face. The startups have a bunch of resources like money, which they spend to develop their products and technologies before they can go to market. And if their tech is sufficiently expensive to develop, they might run out of those resources before they even get to have revenues. This valley is so deadly that many startups never make it to the other side. Now, Intel, of course, is hardly a startup. Just a few years ago, it was still the world's largest chip company. But after CEO Pat Gelsigner took over in 2021, he introduced a plan that was so audacious that it plunged the company into chaos and took what was once the world's largest chipmaker through a valley of death of its own. So far, we've definitely seen Intel go down as a result, and the fall has been extremely painful. The hope is that they might have hit rock bottom right around now, and the question is whether they'll ever be able to survive the climb out. This video is sponsored by Incogni. TSMC, the world's largest chip manufacturer, has about 76,000 employees. Nvidia, the world's largest chip designer, has a bit less than 30,000 employees. Meanwhile, ARM, the maker of the world's most successful CPU architecture, has about 6,000 employees. Today, each of these firms is individually worth significantly more than Intel, and yet Intel has more employees than all three of these combined. That might seem surprising until you realize that Intel has historically been a whole different class of a company. Compare, for example, Nvidia's Grace chips with Intel's competing Xeon 6. The former are designed by Nvidia, they're manufactured by TSMC, and they use ARM's instruction set architecture. Meanwhile, the latter are pretty much all made in-house by Intel. While TSMC, Nvidia, ARM, and most other modern chip companies focus primarily on one segment of the chip-making process, Intel had the complete chain in-house, and so it was a bit like having three of these companies rolled into one. This vertical integration is one of the many things that led to the company's downfall, but for many decades it was actually one of its biggest strengths. Because if all three of these parts actually work really well, then together they create incredible synergies. The x86 instruction set architecture was a bit like a shield for the rest of the business. See, ISAs are basically standards. They describe how a chip executes code or instructions on its most basic level. Once adopted, pretty much every x86 chip can technically run every operating system like Windows, macOS, and Linux, and also the millions of apps on top of those almost automatically. This is extremely convenient, but it also often makes switching away tremendously expensive, because it would often require having to rewrite tons and tons of software for a new standard. x86 was the dominant ISA for decades, and it was, to a large part, owned by Intel, who only had to share it with AMD, which overall created an incredibly comfortable situation for them. Their competition in CPUs was more or less reduced to a single company for many, many years. I mean, talk about a crazy defensive moat. Second, until about 2015, Intel had what were clearly the world's best chip foundries, which were consistently a generation or two ahead of other manufacturers like TSMC and Samsung. That meant Intel chips easily had 10, 20, 30% better power efficiency and performance just from manufacturing, which gave them a huge leg up versus AMD. I also had a call with the fantastic Patrick Kennedy from Serve the Home, who said that ARM chips were considered for servers already back in 2013, but were then disregarded because even if a competitor could beat Intel's designs, they couldn't do so enough to beat Intel's manufacturing. And by the way, if you want to learn more about the world of server chips, that fantastic interview is up on Nebula and linked below. Anyway, having the best fabs means that your chips almost automatically win. And third, Intel also had a big design advantage because they could simply afford to spend more. Last quarter, TSMC, for example, had gross margins of 57.8%. This means using an external fab costs a fortune. TSMC charges around $20,000 to make a single advanced wafer. But unlike others, Intel could use their own fabs and keep much of that margin, which they could instead spend on outdesigning the competition. And for many years, these three areas really strengthened each other. x86 lowered the competition in Intel's core markets, their foundry gave them a massive advantage across the board, and it also made them profitable enough to make world-class designs. So times were good, but as is usual with companies that are a little too shielded from the competition, things eventually started to decay, first little by little, and then very rapidly. In 2005, Steve Jobs announced that the Mac would transition away from IBM's PowerPC chips over to Intel's x86 platform. This deal was reportedly orchestrated by Intel's CEO Paul Otellini, and it sealed the deal for x86 dominance in the computer market almost completely. Intel had won. Then, soon after, Steve Jobs asked that same Paul Otellini if he wanted to bid on the right to make the chip for Apple's upcoming phone as well. Intel had recently bought a small ARM-based chip company it called X-Scale at that point, which might have been perfect for this, but Otellini told Jobs that they wouldn't bid. x86 had just won, and it had done so pretty decisively, so Otellini was actually in the process of killing off their ARM business altogether in favor of a new project that the company called Intel Atom, a mobile chip, but one using x86. Now, perhaps it's understandable that Intel did not want to torpedo its own extremely profitable x86 monopoly, especially at a time when Apple's iPhone was not yet proven to be a success. But of course, now in retrospect, we know that that was one of the biggest missed opportunities in technology history. Once smartphones were inevitably the next big thing, Intel did try again, and they even managed to put Atom chips into some Android phones. That's right, you could get an Asus-branded smartphone with an Intel Inside sticker if you really wanted to. But the company came late. It found that now it had compatibility issues, as most of the smartphone world had already standardized around ARM, and they never caught up. Smartphones were a typical case of the innovator's dilemma. Intel itself, of course, could not create a chip that would undermine their very own x86 dominance, but of course others could, and by the time Intel got the memo, it was too late. But hey, no worries, they still had the PC and also the next best thing. The cloud. As every part of the economy went online, such a demand for data centers emerged that it created a second massive chip boom besides smartphones, and here, Intel, for a while at least, felt right at home. Millions of heavy-duty CPUs were needed that could cost more than $10,000 each, and these high-power workloads were exactly what Intel was comfortable with. For a while, they made tons and tons of money in this market, but then cracks started to form here too. Since 2007, Intel famously adopted a tick-tock model. Tick, the company shrunk down the die in manufacturing. Tock, it adopted a new microarchitecture design. Tick, the die is shrunk again. Tock, a new microarchitecture. Basically, every 18 months, you got one design update and one manufacturing jump. And with this aggressive pace, Intel continued to outpace rivals like TSMC in manufacturing. But then, in 2014, they missed the first tick. They did get 14 nanometers out 1 year later, but then they kept releasing chips with that until 2021, a whole 6 years later. And the next node properly broke the company. 10 nanometers only saw proper volumes in 2019, so 4 years later, and then Intel decided to basically rename this process to Intel 7 later, which they kept using until 2024. Way too late. So their manufacturing first stumbled in 2014 and has still not recovered since, in 10 years. What an absolute disaster. Meanwhile, TSMC's progress of course did not stop, and so the Taiwanese giant simply overtook Intel. Suddenly, manufacturing went from a clear benefit to becoming a massive drag on all of Intel's chips. They were hotter and less powerful than the competition, and no matter what Intel designers tried, they often just couldn't compete any longer. Being vertically integrated can be a super weapon when everything works well, but it also means that if one single critical link in your chain breaks, it can take the entire company with it. Now, while we can blame Intel missing the smartphone revolution on Paul Otellini being a business guy who just didn't grasp the importance of a new technology, the implosion of Intel's manufacturing business happened under Intel CEO Brian Krzanich, a former process engineer under whom Intel took perhaps too many bold technical bets. Unproven techniques like contact over gate and single dummy gates, as well as materials like cobalt and tungsten, were adopted all at once, which meant that engineers struggled to make any of it work. Meanwhile, the one technology that Intel chose not to adopt was extreme ultraviolet lithography. That is despite Intel being one of the biggest contributors to this technology, and also despite EUV becoming the clear winner in the modern chip fabrication in retrospect. Intel did a lot of hard engineering just in the wrong direction. And being this distracted not only let TSMC race past them, it also meant that Intel couldn't react to other massive changes in the chip industry. CPUs were obviously Intel's traditional strength, but the CPU was rapidly losing its central role in computing. Just look at how Qualcomm, for example, presents their phone chips. Their CPU is one of their least important elements. Instead, the image signal processor, the GPU, the hexagon neural processing unit, or the various wireless chips are all shown as more important. Similarly, Intel itself published this chart showing that the ratio of GPUs to CPUs is increasing relentlessly in the data center, and this was before the current AI boom even started. Meanwhile, Serve the Home recently went to film the data center that Elon Musk's X built for Grok AI, where you can typically see 3 to 4 GPUs for every CPU. Given that each GPU can then also cost 3 to 4 times as much, and you end up with a data center that could pay 10 times as much for their GPUs as it does for their CPUs. Now, Intel has tried building various other chips over the decades that went beyond the CPU. From Optane memory, which they shut down, to FPGAs, which they are now partially spinning out, to a big wireless chip business, which they then gave up on and sold to Apple. They tried it all. But then they still ended up being primarily a CPU company in a world where the importance of the CPU is decreasing. Now, despite all of this, Intel started off from such a strong position that they just continued to be the biggest chip company in the world, and an extremely profitable one, years into their troubles. A company like this can make mistake after mistake and just cover up the cracks that start forming. But then, of course, eventually, there is a reckoning. The most immediate threat to Intel came from AMD, who'd been a distant second player for over a decade, suddenly becoming a serious competitor once Intel lost its manufacturing advantage. Change is slow, but this chart from Next Platform beautifully shows the relentless rise of AMD and the decline of Intel in the server space by revenue. Looking at all device categories, last quarter AMD already shipped 28.7% of desktop, 22.3% of laptop, and 24.2% of server x86 CPUs, with healthy gains across the board. But long-term, the even bigger threat to Intel came from the rise of ARM. Frustrated with Intel's slow progress, Intel took on the Herculean task of moving macOS to its own ARM chips. Microsoft, of course, is in the process of pushing for Windows on ARM, and servers started getting flooded with ARM chips too. Microsoft, Amazon, and Google, the 3 big cloud vendors, all built their own ARM-based server CPUs, and so did Nvidia and many others. ARM is suddenly everywhere, and if it gets enough adoption on PCs and servers, Intel could find its own x86 chips suddenly being the ones that struggle with compatibility. That is an existential threat that Intel might never recover from, and together with the troubles in manufacturing, it was time for a complete rethinking of the company. Pat Gelsigner was appointed CEO of Intel in 2021, and right away he was seen as a sort of messiah figure. Early in his career, he was the chief architect of Intel's i48 microprocessor. He worked his way up to becoming the chief technology officer of the company, where he was deeply respected, and he came back with the mandate to put things right. And his plan to put things right? It was really extreme. As an outsider, he very honestly admitted all the things that were broken with Intel and promised to engineer their way back to leadership again. First, he, at least temporarily, outsourced a huge part of their chip production to TSMC. This was an unthinkable move for the earlier Intel and a clear admission of their own manufacturing basically killing their business. But using TSMC was supposed to at least stop the worst of the bleeding right away. Meanwhile, for manufacturing, he correctly assessed that, on the high end at least, this is a winner-takes-all market. The best fab attracts the best customers, their devices sell the best, which means they get a lot of money, they make a lot of money for the fab, who can then use that to invest into furthering their lead even more, and so on and so forth. They keep getting stronger, everyone else keeps getting weaker. So he decided Intel needed its crown back. Remember the extremely aggressive tick-tock schedule? 1 node jump every 18 months? Well, Pat said Intel would do 5 nodes in 4 years now. That is less than 10 months for each node, which is so aggressive, it would see Intel surpass TSMC's chip making by 2025 if achieved. Nothing of the sort has ever been done before. He claimed that the company would not only need to figure out EUV, the key technology that partially broke their chip manufacturing, but that he would also pay almost anything to be the first to adopt high-NA EUV, which is sort of the next generation of this technology. Now, on top of this being incredibly technically challenging, it's also incredibly expensive and inefficient. Developing each node costs billions, if not tens of billions, and it's one of humanity's most complicated engineering challenges. Now, normally, a fab would want to, use that node to make millions of ultra-profitable chips with it for years to make back their investment, but Intel didn't have time for that. They don't need this many nodes, especially when many of their chips are now made by TSMC, so some of them might only be used to make a single type of chip before the company basically moved on from it. So they are paying extra to rush the development of what is already one of the world's most complicated engineering challenges, then they're deciding to not use that, and instead they're also paying TSMC for using their really expensive services. That is tens of billions of dollars basically set on fire, and so Pat needed to find a lot of money very quick. Conveniently, he was running one of the world's largest companies, which somehow still made almost $80 billion in revenue the year Pat took over and was still extremely profitable. So right away, he changed that. The company under Pat simply started spending all of its money and more. Beside that, he also cut expenses by stopping to pay dividends, by starting mass layoffs, by closing businesses that were not making profits yet, etc. And Pat also sold off a whole lot of things. For example, Intel sold off 49% of one of their chip fabs in Ireland to a private equity fund, which netted them $11 billion. Mobileye, their self-driving car chip business, went public, raising Intel a good sum of money, as Intel sold a lot of their shares in it. Intel wants to sell a minority share in Altera, their FPGA unit, which they hope to raise billions, and so on. And finally, he of course convinced the Biden government to commit $19.5 billion in funding through the CHIPS Act and various governments in Europe for a big subsidy package as well, in the hopes of bringing manufacturing back to the West. He was very aggressive about finding money so he can use that to beat TSMC and so that manufacturing could become Intel's superweapon again. If that happened, not only could he bring his own chips back in-house, ideally beating the competition with comfortable margins again, but this time he'd also open up Intel's foundries to just about anyone. Like TSMC, Intel Foundry planned to manufacture chips for external companies from Apple to Nvidia, Qualcomm, and even AMD. It would be a proper independent fab and potentially the crown jewel of Western technological independence. And seeing how insanely profitable and also important TSMC is, that's a pretty exciting vision. His plan was to sacrifice just about everything for this vision, truly a valley of death. So, how's it going for them? Starting with manufacturing, progress has been mixed. On the worrying front, Intel has already cancelled its 3rd out of 5 nodes. The Arrow Lake chips that were supposed to be made with this Intel 20A process were instead made by TSMC. Now they tried to spin this as a positive of basically skipping ahead to 18A, which is a pretty similar technology, so maybe this is not a massive deal, but it's a significant wobble in a plan that can't really afford wobbles. The company also had to delay or more likely cancel their massive planned expansion to Germany with brand new fabs, which is probably a sign that they have less money than they hoped for. And similarly, funds from the Biden government's CHIPS Act keep getting delayed, and the new Trump presidency of course adds a whole lot of uncertainty to government support as well. All of this, combined with terrible earnings, caused Intel stock to massively underperform, which creates huge risks for Pat. If investors don't believe that the plan is working, they can fire the CEO, and with such low valuations, other companies like Qualcomm are tipped to be interested in buying Intel or even stripping it for parts. The sharks are circling when they smell blood in the water, and Intel is definitely bleeding very heavily. Now, I don't think the US government would allow the company to be completely dismantled, to be sold off to a foreign buyer, for example, but a lot of bad things could happen. But meanwhile, on the positive side, Intel did complete the jump to Intel 4 and 3, its first 2 nodes. They did so roughly on time. Intel 4 successfully rolled out EUV, finally, and Intel 3 was used to make the company's new Xeon 6 server chips, which Patrick from Serve the Home tells me are finally really competitive, so theoretically this means that the manufacturing has to be pretty good. Intel claims that 18A, the 4th node, is on track. They say that defect densities are good, and they've already announced multiple external companies like Amazon, for example, who said that they'd be interested in making their own chips with it, because this should be Intel's first node that will be open to others. 18A is also the node where Intel claims that they'll finally start reaching parity with TSMC, more or less, so a lot is riding on this node, but of course we won't know how good it is until we actually see it. Okay, and moving on to design, that has been a pretty mixed bag too. Here's a list of their relatively recent chip families, and here's my very basic attempt at ranking them for how competitive they are overall without getting too much in the weeds. Xeon 6 seems very nice, and it's a sorely needed bright spot. Lunar Lake in my own testing has been pretty good, but not quite a home run. Meteor Lake was mostly disappointing, and Arrow Lake got pretty much demolished by the competition. So mixed result for a company, especially as they were supposed to get a big boost from switching to TSMC, but then they're probably also wildly distracted by the restructuring, so maybe not unexpected. Now, based on all of this, I honestly don't know if Intel will make it out of the valley of the death, if yes, how well, or whether they'll be sold off for parts halfway through. But the other question worth asking is whether Pat deciding to go down this specific path was the right choice, because there's clearly also a second available path. Intel could have just chosen to accept defeat in manufacturing and could have chosen to find a way to sell off its fabs. AMD did exactly that when they spun off theirs and called them global foundries, while Nvidia, who never owned foundries in the first place, is now worth 33 times as much as Intel and 4 times as much as TSMC. Clearly, chip companies without fabs can thrive. And maybe selling off manufacturing would have allowed Pat to spend all of their time and energy on making sure that they actually designed world-class chips. That might have allowed them to beat AMD or to fight back against the ARM threat, or the company could have prioritized their AI chip business with Gaudi. Nvidia is on track to sell about $60 billion in AI chips this year, AMD is looking at about $5 billion, while Intel will miss even its $500 million target. Intel could have focused on winning this market instead of focusing on trying to beat TSMC. It is still too early to say whether Pat's gamble will actually pay off, and to be fair, if it does, they could become one of the true giants of the industry. But this has been an extremely risky bet and also an extremely bumpy ride. Okay, and because you seem to enjoy hearing about corporate disasters, I want to tell you about another pretty insane one that you've probably missed. About 3 months ago, a company called National Public Data was breached and reportedly lost 2.9 billion records containing full names, current and past addresses, social security numbers, dates of birth, phone numbers, and more from citizens in the US, UK, and Canada. National Public Data is ironically a totally private company and one of dozens of data brokers that hoover up the entire internet to create profiles of you, without your consent of course, which they then sell to pretty much whoever is willing to pay. They themselves list investigators, background check websites, data resellers, and more, but we also know that even government agencies have decided that it's often easier to just buy data on you from data brokers than it is to do the spying themselves. But there's a silver lining to the story, which is that in these countries at least, you actually have the right to have your data deleted from, for example, a data broker, which apparently in the case of National Public Data actually worked. Quote, the database does not contain information from individuals who use data opt-out services. And Incogni's data removal service is what I use for this, and you can see that they've already successfully deleted me from over 80 such data hoarders so far. That is an insane number. Incogni finds which databases you are in, they send the requests on your behalf, they deal with objections, and they keep doing this even after you are deleted, so data brokers don't just add you back right again after they deleted you, which is why this is a subscription. They support multiple email addresses and 3 physical addresses with a single subscription, plus they're also family plans. Now again, the removal only necessarily works in places that have legal frameworks requiring it, but that's a pretty good selection already. To sign up, be sure to use my code TechAltar to get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan. That is incogni.com/TechAltar for 60% off, and I'll see you next Friday.